Good evening, folks. My name is Mary Smith, and if there's some time that you can't hear me, just raise your hand and I'll try and talk a little bit louder. I was here at Abraham Lincoln's final funeral on May 4th, 1865. I'd like to tell you about it and the long goodbye that our country gave Abraham Lincoln. He was shot April 14th, 1865, while he and his wife Mary were attending a play at the Ford's Theater. There were several doctors who were in the audience, and so they of course rushed to the president's aid. They could tell immediately that his wound was mortal. He would not survive. So with assistance from others, they carried the president across the street to the Peterson boarding house. They carried him to a small bedroom in the back. The president was so tall, 6'4", they had to lie him diagonally in the bed. Word got out that the president was dying. So friends, family, members of his cabinet all crowded into that little room to be with the president in his final hours. One of those was his Secretary of War, Edwin Stanton. As night became dawn, the president's breathing became more shallow. At 7:22 a.m., April 15th, one of the doctors crossed the president's arm across his chest and said, "He is gone." And then Secretary of War Stanton, with tears streaming down his face, said, "Now he belongs to the ages." The following Wednesday, the first funeral for the president was held. It was a lovely spring day in Washington. The sky was blue and there was a breeze blowing through, but the White House was the opposite of that brightness. It was almost completely covered on the outside with black crepe. On the inside, there was black cloth on the chandeliers and around the mirrors, even on the floor. In the East Room of the White House, there was a large flower-covered catafalque, and on that catafalque was the casket and body of Abraham Lincoln. 600 people crowded into that East Room for that first funeral service for the president. Beside the casket stood our newly appointed president, Andrew Johnson. At the foot of the casket were the Lincoln boys, Robert and Tad. And at the head of the casket was General Ulysses S. Grant, crying uncontrollably. And then after that funeral, they carried the president's casket out into that bright sunny day and placed it in a funeral car. The funeral car, along with a large procession, went from the White House to the Capitol building. And there they placed President Lincoln's body in the rotunda for 24 hours for people to come by and say goodbye. The following morning, a special 9-car funeral train left Washington, carrying the bodies of the president and his beloved son, Willie. Willie had died 3 years earlier of typhoid fever. That train was headed here, Springfield, Illinois. Now, along the way, they made stops in 11 different cities, and they each had their own funeral for the president. When the train went through smaller communities, people actually knelt beside the railroad tracks and bowed their head in respect for the president. All along the way, buildings were draped in mourning cloth, flags hung at half-mast, bells tolled, guns were fired, and at night, torches and bonfires were lit. On May 3rd, there were thousands of us lined up along the railroad tracks in Springfield, awaiting the arrival of the train that was carrying our martyred president. Our whole community was in mourning. Our buildings were draped in black. Our flags flew at half-mast. There was such a great sense of sadness amongst everyone. When the train arrived at a little after 9 in the morning, it too was draped in mourning cloth. We watched silently as the casket of the president was taken from the train and put in a beautiful black hearse. The hearse was pulled by 6 handsome black horses. The horses and the funeral car were all adorned in mourning ornaments. It was a solemn and yet awe-inspiring sight. And then a large escort of military units, personnel, family, and friends followed the hearse through downtown Springfield to the Capitol building. It too was decorated magnificently, both inside and out. Now, if you remember, the president, before he was president, was a representative in Illinois. So he had worked in that very building. He'd given speeches in the Hall of Representatives, where his body now lay, his casket lay, on another beautifully decorated catafalque. Now, people waited for hours that day outside, lined up to get in to pay their respects to the president. For 3 hours that evening, only women, their escorts, and their children were allowed into the hall. I was one of those women. I'll never forget it. It was reported that 75,000 people paid their respects to the president on that one day alone. And then the next morning, May 4th, they put the lid of the president's casket on, and then again transported him to that beautiful black hearse, and along with a large procession, made their way to Oak Ridge Cemetery. Now, in that large procession, in the middle of it was old Bob, Lincoln's horse, and toward the end of it were people like me, just ordinary citizens, people who loved and respected Mr. Lincoln. I did think it was strange that the only immediate family member of the president who was here at the funeral was his oldest son, Robert. He'd arrived the night before by train. But Mary, his wife, was too distraught to attend any of the funerals, even in Washington. So she remained there with their youngest son, Tad. When the hearse arrived here, the casket of the president was placed in this vault next to Willie's casket, while a 250-member choir from St. Louis sang. It's impossible to describe how moving and powerful those moments were. Then during the funeral, several clergy spoke. One of them delivered the president's second inaugural address. And then the choir sang, "Farewell, Heavenly Father, friend and guardian." And that is exactly how those of us at the funeral felt. The president was our friend, our father, and our guardian. He was gone, and now, indeed, he belongs to the ages. I will take any questions if you have them.